To start this sermon off, I want to preface that what I will be preaching about involves some sensitive themes. I'll be sharing about the experiences of soldiers and those who supported them in history, some of which might feel difficult for some of you to hear. I offer a gentle reminder for you to take care of yourself and to notice what comes up for you as you listen and hear about these moral wounds. And that being said, I invite you to close your eyes for a moment and to imagine the following scene. You are a United States service member deployed in modern-day Baghdad, Iraq. Riding in the gunner's seat of a Humvee, you brace as the Humvee weaves through convoluted streets, past obstacles and fallen rubble. The vehicle comes to an abrupt stop where only a few feet in front of you sits a stripped, parked car. Through your gun's sights, you see a silhouette off to the side holding a cell phone. Your heart immediately sinks into your gut. From your training, you know that improvised explosive devices, also called IEDs, are sometimes detonated by cell phones. You are now faced with an excruciating decision. You must decide in seconds to shoot the silhouette, risking the death of a civilian, or to hold your fire, knowing that your delay might have just cost the lives of other soldiers as well as your own. You may now open your eyes. While this opening meditation is fictional and not an actual soldier's account, this type of situation is familiar to service members serving in our modern-day war zones. War zones that produce ambiguous situations and require split-second decision-making are especially prone to cause what we've begun to name as moral injury. Moral injury is a term that has recently emerged to describe the psychological and spiritual wounds that result from these types of situations. And it's an injury that's deeper than the skin. Moral injury is briefly described as the shame and guilt that a person feels when one commits or witnesses acts that violate their deeply held moral beliefs and values. It involves a sense of feeling tainted to the core of your own humanity and who you are as a person, that your actions have come to define you, that there is no hope for forgiveness. It involves a deep spiritual and psychological wrestling that leaves a person's sense of their moral self shattered. Though we have treatments for the physiological and even some of the psychological impacts of trauma, like PTSD and other anxiety disorders, these moral wounds remain largely untreated. Moral injury itself is not a diagnosis. There is no pill or medication that you can prescribe to heal a broken spirit. All in all, these wounds run deep and are long-lasting, and oftentimes they leave those who wrestle with them feeling like they are wrestling with them alone. Indeed, while service members go overseas and fight on behalf of civilians, there is often no place in our society to help them hold these moral wounds. Service members are often given the message that they are to simply move on, to deal with it and continue on even when continuing on feels impossible. Service members leave as one person and come back transformed as another. They are transformed in the ways that they wrestle with these situations and questions all on their own. So in honor of Veterans Day this past week, my focus is not just on telling the stories of individuals who experienced moral injuries like these. Overall, I want to point to what moral injury says to us about the full human costs of war and the moral struggles that we are facing in our own world today. Within this theme of holding history this month, I want to focus on how moral injury relates to our own Unitarian Universalist history. What does this history mean for who we are as a faith, and what role our faith plays in creating a more just equitable, and compassionate world? How does making peace intersect with these harsh realities that so many individuals are left to struggle with on their own? My sermon this morning draws heavily on research I conducted a few years ago exploring moral injury in parts of our Unitarian Universalist history. This is actually the same research that I briefly mentioned last Sunday that I got to have the privilege of conducting in Harvard's rich archives. While an undergraduate, I studied moral injury with Dr. Dan McCannon at Harvard Divinity School, one of our leading scholars of Unitarian Universalist history. We developed a plan to research moral injury as Unitarians and Universalists encountered it in previous wars, namely the U.S. Civil War. Today, I'd like to unpack the experiences of two of our spiritual ancestors in the UU tradition, the stories of Mary Livermore and James Hosmer. Both Livermore and Hosmer encountered people who struggled with moral injuries. In fact, I suggest they even wrestled with moral injuries themselves. And though we have this language today of moral injury, the language of moral injury didn't exist in their time. And because of this, the moral wounds that so many soldiers encountered were so sparsely documented. At times, they were simply not even talked about. Nevertheless, Mary Livermore, a Universalist in the time of the Civil War, did document her encounters with soldiers and their moral injuries. Jeff, would you be able to share a photo of Mary for us? Mary Livermore began her service in the Civil War as a Union Army nurse in 1861. While never in combat, Livermore worked with soldiers in various hospitals. Even though Livermore was a nurse and wasn't an ordained minister, she ministered to soldiers in the throes of shame as a result of their military service. Livermore, in her diaries, writes about one particular moment when she helped to console a dying soldier. Making her rounds, every bed occupied with a wounded body, she came across a soldier in deep distress. Gasping for air, he suffered from severe pain, with both of his legs amputated, his right and left arms crushed and broken, and being shot twice in the abdomen. Trying to comfort the soldier, Livermore asked him about his state of panic and fear. The soldier replied, "I can't live, I know it. There's no chance for me, I've got to die. And I can't die. I am afraid to die." In the way of a skilled chaplain, Livermore asked the soldier why he was so afraid to die. "I ain't fit to die," the soldier remarked. "I have lived an awful life. I shall go to hell." Noticing his soul in deep distress, Livermore told the man of God's ability to forgive all sins. And after having the soldier repeat a prayer with her, this spiritual consolation did little to calm him. The soldier asked Livermore to bring a Methodist minister to the ward for him to receive final absolution. Livermore and the minister did their best to alleviate the soldier's suffering in his final moments. The soldier listened to the chaplain's themes of centering on Christ's love and trusting in God to deliver forgiveness to all of those who seek it. And praying together in song, the soldier reached a state of peace. As Livermore writes, the burden rolled from the boy's heart. They sang as the soldier lay finally at peace in his bed. Terrified to face the reality of his imminent death, the soldier feared hell and eternal damnation. Marked with guilt, the soldier never disclosed the things that he did in his life that continue to torment him. This is characteristic of moral injuries, with service members sometimes and often not sharing their morally injurious experiences only moments before death. Livermore, a Universalist, witnessed a soldier wrestling with a moral injury. She herself was transformed by this experience, unable to eat or sleep for days after, feeling the weight of this spiritual injury. Moving from Livermore's story, another ancestor in our lineage as Unitarian Universalists is James Hosmer, a minister who fought for the Union Army in the U.S. Civil War in the 52nd Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers. Jeff, would you be able to show us a picture of Hosmer? Hosmer enlisted as a private in 1862, leaving behind his newly settled ministry as the Unitarian pastor of the First Church in Deerfield. A staunch abolitionist, Hosmer felt it was his duty and higher calling as a soldier to serve in the war. From his Civil War Journal entries titled The Color Guard, Hosmer discusses the guilt he feels from witnessing and even benefiting from the horrible aspects of war. He recounts soldiers turned loose to kill livestock, to loot cotton and sugar, and to destroy property. Wastefully, many of the soldiers would take only a fraction of the meat from animals, leaving the rest to simply rot. If the owners of a property offered any resistance, their weapons were taken and they were overpowered. Feeling this guilt, Hosmer writes that I took no part in the act of foraging, though I own that I was once, then more than once, a partaker in the spoils. Even though Hosmer never did any of the looting and pillaging himself at first, he still felt morally implicated. Government rations of bread and bacon simply weren't enough to keep these soldiers going through harsh labor and weather conditions. Out of necessity, Hosmer shared in these rations, which he later felt injured from. And in his journal, Hosmer later confides to having stolen goods, assisting in a robbery of a sugar cask, and to have helped to butcher some of the livestock. Wishing to stay out of the pillaging, Hosmer was forced to violate his conscience. Hosmer's guilt from these events followed him throughout the course of the war and even beyond. Returning, Hosmer no longer felt that he was suited for parish ministry. He left the ministry and became a professor. And Hosmer wrestled with the moral aftermath of the Civil War with how it had impacted his own theology. His heart was changed forever. So many of the soldiers still experience this rift today when they return. You may recall in the earlier reading from Genesis, which reads, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Then the man said, You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. This is a passage that actually a Unitarian Universalist military chaplain gave me that relates heavily with moral injury. Jacob, in this passage, wrestles with a mysterious man believed to have been God or one of God's angels, asking that the man bless him. In turn, Jacob wrestles with life and is given a new name. Moral injuries like these leave marks, and they force us and those who suffer from them to wrestle with life and understand themselves in the wake of new names, feelings, and struggles. So where do we go from here? How can we help to heal some of these moral wounds that we've only begun to start identifying? We have a moral responsibility to make space in our hearts and congregations for those who go off to fight on our behalf, who are too often left to wrestle with life alone. Even more, we continue to see moral injuries beyond war in our day-to-day, in the ways that healthcare workers make these life or death decisions, in the ways that our ongoing legacies of racism and white supremacy continue to give our moral hearts this burden of injury. As Unitarian Universalists, we need a faith like the early Universalists to remind us of our commitment to this all-encompassing, radically accepting, and reckless love. We need a faith like Mary Livermore's, which shows us that simply listening in times when we often speak can sow seeds of peace. We need a faith like James Hosmer's, a faith in the goodness of people, the goodness of one another, and our own abilities to work toward making this world a more just place. May you be rooted in this love and continue our historic legacy as peacemakers, as lovers, as justice seekers, and action takers. May it be so, and amen.